Well, hello everyone. I hope you're doing well and welcome back to this second video presentation introducing the Garden of Forking Paths. In the previous presentation, I talked a little bit about the context of the Garden of Forking Paths, its publication history, its role in Borges's broader work, and a bit about its place in the genre of espionage fiction. In this presentation, I want to talk about the central philosophical theme that is raised in the Garden of Forking Paths, and that is, of course, the question of time. So before we get started, a really important caveat. From a philosophical perspective, time is an immensely complicated issue, and I'm not going to even begin to probe those complexities in this presentation. We're just going to talk in very, very general and abstract terms. If, however, you are interested in exploring the topic more thoroughly, I've posted in the description box below a link to an article on time from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which reviews in quasi-technical language at times the central philosophical theories about time, the arguments for and against those theories, so you can get a sense of how it is that philosophers have thought about and talked about time. But for this presentation, we're just going to speak in very broad generalities. The goal will be to sort of enrich your understanding of the story and appreciation of what it is that Borges is trying to do philosophically in this piece. Very well. So Borges takes up the question of time in the Garden of Forking Paths, and if he does so, he inevitably does so against the implicit backdrop of other conceptions of time. As far as I can tell, there are in human history and human culture two general ways of thinking about time, of understanding time. The first way will be familiar to you. It's the conception of time that's characteristic of our culture, of most modern Western or Westernized cultures. And that is simply a conception of time as linear. A linear conception of time sees time as a series of events sort of proceeding along a single axis, like a line. This is why it's called linear time, having to do with lines. A linear conception of time has a couple of implications. The first and probably most important implication is that on a linear conception of time, because all of the events are occurring along a single axis, every event is unrepeatable. Now, this is not to say, of course, that I can't sort of do the same kind of thing over and over again. I'll have lunch today, and I'll have lunch tomorrow, and the next day, and so on. But each of those events are distinct. They occupy different regions of the timeline. The second implication of a linear conception of time is that time flows in a single direction. It flows from the past through the present and into the future. And this means, among other things, that the past is irrevocable, it's inaccessible. Once a thing has happened, we can't sort of go back to it, analyze it, and access it in any straightforward way. It also means that the future is always sort of a receding horizon in front of us. We occupy a particular moment at any given moment on that timeline relative to a past and to a future. The other conception of time is what you might think of as not a linear, but a cyclical or circular conception of time. Unlike a linear conception of time, a circular conception of time invites us to see time not as proceeding along a single axis like a line that flows irrevocably in one direction, but as a kind of circle. Now, this allows for, among other things, repetition. It allows for the repetition of ages of time. It allows for the repetition of events. It allows for the repetition maybe even of entire human lives, as we'll see in just a moment. Ordinarily, circular conceptions of time are associated or have been associated with what we used to call erroneously primitive cultures. So for instance, if you recall in 2012, I think it was, the so-called Mayan long count calendar came to some prominence in Western media. And it came to some prominence because that was the year in which the calendar was supposed to sort of come to its end. And everyone thought, I don't know if honestly or not, but people at least affected or gave the impression of thinking that, well, since the Mayan calendar is ending, probably the world's going to end as well. Now, of course, the world, as far as we can tell, did not end in 2012, but this gives you a sense of what it might be like to inhabit a circular conception of time, a conception of time in which the universe, the age begins, it completes a cycle, and then ends. As I was saying, circular conceptions of time are sometimes thought to be characteristic of what we used to call primitive cultures, but this is not always the case. There are certain elements of the Western intellectual tradition that also seem to have circular or cyclical conceptions of time. And here I'm thinking primarily of the Stoics. If you've heard of Stoicism, Stoicism is a philosophical movement that was born in Greece and then moved to Rome. It's associated with philosophers like Epictetus in Greece, and then maybe Seneca in Rome, and Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, and maybe also Boethius, who was sort of the last properly Roman thinker who espoused a Stoic or quasi-Stoic conception of reality. Now, Stoicism, as you're probably aware, is most known for its moral doctrines, and this is the way the term is used almost exclusively now. But the Stoics weren't just moral philosophers. They also had a rich and complex cosmology that implied a circular conception of time. So according to the Stoics, the universe does not proceed along a single line that moves irrevocably from the past to the future, like it would on a linear conception of time, but rather the universe is a series of cycles. So the universe begins with what the Stoics call the pneuma, which is just the Greek word for breath or wind. In the beginning, the pneuma is associated, indeed identified, with God. Over time, the pneuma begins to self-differentiate. And this self-differentiation gives rise to the four elements of classical physics, so earth, water, fire, and air. This self-differentiation, in turn, explains all of the physical things that we see around us in the world. But this is only part of the story, according to the Stoics. Over time, the self-differentiation that begins with the pneuma sort of reverses itself and goes through a process of self-disintegration, so that the pneuma, which self-differentiates into matter, earth, water, fire, and air, begins to sort of disintegrate. And this process of disintegration culminates in a great conflagration, a great fire, which the Stoics called ekpyrosis, from the Greek word pur, which just means fire. So the earth sort of ends in this great fiery conflagration called ekpyrosis. But even this is not the end of the story, according to the Stoics, because time is not proceeding along a line that moves irrevocably from the past to the present. After this event of ekpyrosis, this great conflagration, everything starts up again. So we're back to pneuma, undifferentiated matter, and then that gives rise to the matter that we see around us, which in turn gives rise to this great conflagration, and this sort of cycle repeats itself indefinitely many times, according to the Stoics. Yeah. So there's an example of a cyclical or circular conception of time within the Western intellectual tradition. Now, in The Garden of Forking Paths, Borges is working with a conception of temporality, of time, that is neither strictly linear nor strictly circular, nor, I think we can add in any way, an amalgamation or a mixture of these two conceptions of time. It's a different conception of time. And perhaps it's easiest to appreciate the conception of time that Borges is working with by looking at an image. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see an image that may give you a sense of what it is that Borges is thinking about here. The easiest way, I think, to get a handle on what Borges is thinking is to compare or to think about the way that the world looks given a linear conception of time. So imagine the following scenario. This afternoon, let's say around 2 o'clock, I'm going to have to make a decision. I could, on the one hand, sit in my chair and read more Borges, or I could, let's say, go for a walk. You know, on the timeline I have on the screen here, this decision point is represented by these green dots. Now, think about what this looks like on a linear conception of time. So I come to the moment, it's 2 o'clock, I have to decide, am I going to read more Borges, or am I going to go for a walk? On a linear conception of time, I make a choice. I decide to sit in my chair and read more Borges, or I decide to go for a walk. Now, one of the implications of this choice is that in the act of choosing to do one thing, sitting in my chair and reading, I also exclude other possibilities. So I can't sit in my chair and read Borges and go for a walk at the same time, just like I can't play tennis at the park and take a shower at the same time in my bathroom at home. This is an implication of a linear conception of time. The conception of time that Borges is working with in The Garden of Forking Paths is, as the title suggests, a forking conception of time. That is to say, a conception of time in which at every decision point, at every green dot on this line, rather than selecting an option and excluding other options, it turns out that all of the possible options are realized. So I'm moving along this timeline, it's approaching 2 o'clock, and I decide to go for a walk on this timeline. But because we're dealing with a forking conception of time rather than a linear conception of time, my decision to read Borges is also realized. Now, realized in what sense? Well, realized in the sense that at that moment, at that decision point where I have various possibilities and then select one of them, on Borges' conception, I don't actually select one of them. In one timeline, I'm reading Borges sitting in the chair. In the other timeline, I'm going for a walk. Maybe in another timeline, I'm having a ham sandwich. Maybe in another timeline, I'm taking a shower. Maybe in another timeline, I'm talking to my wife. Right? All of these things are actually happening in sort of different parallel universes. Now, this means, of course, that there are also different parallel me's, that at every decision point, I am, as it were, sort of splitting myself, and I continue to exist. I persist with different properties, like the property of reading Borges at 2 o'clock and the property of taking a walk at 2 o'clock in these sort of different and parallel universes. Now, this is the basic idea. This is the basic conception of time that Borges is toying with in The Garden of Forking Paths. Now, as far as I'm aware, there is no human culture which has, as a matter of course, adopted this conception of time. There is, as far as I'm aware, no human culture that thinks of time instinctively in this way. It's a weird way of thinking about time, and yet, for all its weirdness, and despite the fact that, as far as I'm aware, no human culture has instinctively or as a matter of course thought about time in this way, this conception of time has gained some traction in a somewhat surprising place. And this is the world of quantum mechanics. If you're not familiar with quantum mechanics, and even if you are familiar with quantum mechanics, I would encourage you to take a look at some of the videos we've posted on Blackboard dealing with quantum mechanics, and particularly with what is called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, as you will see from the videos in much more detail, presupposes or implies the existence of parallel worlds in something like the way that Borges describes in the story. And this has to do with the nature of quantum events. As in Borges' story, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics implies parallel universes, really existing parallel universes. It implies the existence of parallel me's and you's. So in one universe, I'm sort of proceeding along this timeline, but in another really existing universe, I'm proceeding along a different timeline and making different choices and having different sorts of experiences. It's for this reason that some critics have suggested that Borges' story presages certain developments in the interpretation of quantum mechanics, and particularly in this case, what's called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. So if you'd like to learn more about that and its possible relationship to the Garden of Forking Paths, take a look at some of the videos we've posted on Blackboard. Very well. So that gives you a sense, very general sense, admittedly, of the way that Borges is raising the question of time in the Garden of Forking Paths. I want to leave you with one additional question that you ought to think about as you're reading through the story. In the last presentation, we talked about how it is that Borges is using the spy thriller genre. One thing you want to be thinking about as you're reading the story is this. Why is it that Borges uses the spy thriller genre to raise this abstract metaphysical question about the nature of time? Is the spy thriller genre merely an occasion for raising this question? Could he have used any genre to raise the question? Or is there some connection between the two? Is there something about the spy thriller as a genre that inclines Borges to use it to raise this abstract metaphysical question about the nature of time? If you can sort of get a handle on that question and propose a possible answer, I think you will be in a better position to see the coherence of the Garden of Forking Paths as a piece of literary fiction that is also raising a philosophical question. Very well. So keep all those things in mind as you're reading the story. And of course, as always, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to let us know. Very well. All right. That's all for now. I hope you have a nice afternoon. And again, let us know if you have any questions at all. All right. Bye-bye.